published a paper a couple of years ago about palliative care and end-of-life care and intensive care. And Alex Sarides is a consultant from the Wellington Regional and is somewhat of a, I don't want to use the word, I don't want to call him the death guy, but he's the death guy.
I'm not the death guy.
This is a moniker he picked up from what it was at SMAC a year and a half ago.
Yeah, in Berlin.
In Berlin, where you said you wanted to make dying great again.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that I want to be the death guy, though. And also, obviously, I need to be clear that making dying great again at that time was a slightly witty phrase on a man who's turned out to be one of the worst people alive. And I don't want to be associated with that phrase anymore. But it was a very unfortunate choice of words. At the time, I thought he'd just be some bumbling idiot and we'd all laugh and he'd be gone. Yeah. But now it turns out he's a psychopath. I want nothing more to do with him. So I recant that phrase, if I may.
So one of the things I want to talk to you about is that... let me let that go. One of the things I want to talk about is that... I mean, you have a reputation about wanting to talk about death. And I think that's probably because other people don't want to. Why are you so willing to talk about it when everybody else treats it as a taboo?
So that's the question I want to explore really, is why do you think people aren't willing to talk about death? Is it something that... Why are we as professionals, certainly in intensive care, who see more death than anyone else? I mean, the numbers I used yesterday, in my own unit, we've got a 10% mortality, we admit 1,900 patients a year, that's 190 deaths or a death every 2 days. Now, if any other ward had a death every 2 days, if the general surgeons had a death every 2 days, then they'd probably be closed down and prevented from operating. But because of what we do, we're immersed in it, yet we don't really talk about it. But more importantly, we take it away from our colleagues, because ICU often is a place where your bad patients go to die. So our colleagues don't have to deal with it either. So I think we need a conversation with an intensive care about the way we do death, about whether we do it well, about whether, because we've got all the machines that go ping and hide death from us, that we don't recognise it when we should. Or also about the sort of people that are being referred to us. Why are we the person who has to have the conversation to say no? Yeah. And often we are the people who are asked to come and tell this patient about the things you're not going to do to them. So the physicians or the surgeons, and I'm not being tribal or bashing other specialties, it's my real experience that's been across 3 countries and 20 years of working in ICU, is exactly that, is that we're the people who get called upon to tell them we're not going to do things and to have the conversation.
So, Nish, you wrote a paper about end-of-life care on intensive care. What were some of the things that you found out?
So the paper was really looking at the quality of transition into end-of-life care, in particular the cancer cohort patients. And some of the things highlighted was mainly about our conversations with patients, and often they're too critically unwell to participate in any conversation regarding end-of-life care. And I think often we do miss the boat. And the paper really highlighted that we're not very good at communicating with our patients early enough so that they can participate. And we're not really good at doing it in an MDT format. Perhaps something that you highlighted about working with other teams as well as us and try and breaking bad news together.
So one of the things that I tweeted at the conference was, it was something that you said, which is that we have, although we don't have a legal duty, we have a moral and ethical duty to tell our patients that they are dying. And I couldn't agree with you anymore. But we and I think it's because in intensive care we are superheroes. We are the thin blue line that everybody relies on to separate their patient from death.
So there's a whole lot of things I think that feed into that. We, by the nature of what we do, which is, as I said before, we have a system that makes sure that if someone is sick, that we're called. Yeah. And the Venn diagram between sick and dying has got a significantly large overlap. And how big that overlap is dependent upon what we decide to do. Yeah. And also, I suppose, because we know what can be done, we also know what can't be done. And we would know, for example, we would know the data that if we admit a 80-year-old to ICU, the percentage of that person being able to walk out of hospital alive and well. Whereas maybe the geriatrician who looks at that subset knows that information for someone admitted to their ward, but doesn't know that for someone admitted to ICU. So we have some outcome data. We're not very good at it because we don't really, unless you have ICU outpatients and you see what happens to the people you admit. But we also have the ability to turn people into bad survivors. But I mean, I agree. I think we do. We do have a moral obligation to tell people. You'll be aware of the surprise question that was mooted a few years ago from GPs to have end-of-life conversations with their patients. If you thought your patient was likely to be dead within a year, if you were surprised if they were still alive, you need to tell the patient that, because your patient has other plans. They may have weddings, holidays, all sorts of stuff planned, and mostly they may be completely ignorant of the fact that their doctor thinks they won't be alive in a year. Now, I think that is a moral obligation for you to tell your patients. If you have information that will significantly alter what they do in their last year of life, then you need to tell them. Now, often in our case, it's subacute. We're coming down to possibly the last few weeks or even days of that person's life. So that imperative is even more there to share that information with the patient. There may be a whole lot of stuff that they have not addressed. There may be family members they haven't spoken to in 20 years for some ridiculous feud that they want to close off before they die. But if you're not giving them that information, then morally that's a deeply unpleasant thing to do. And I think that's what I say. We don't want to talk about it, but we have to. And because we're the pointy end and we're often the final vanguard standing between death and not death, then we feel the pressure more than most to have that conversation with people, even though we're not particularly trained in it. The people who are trained in subacute death possibly are more the palliative care physicians, because they're talking to the patient about what's going to happen and what they'd like to do. As you would know, many of our conversations aren't with the patient, they're with the family, because the patient, as you said, is already too unwell to communicate. So we're having these conversations by proxy, when in fact the most important person is the patient. But often by the time they get to us, we've missed the boat, because by very nature of the fact we're seeing them, they're now too unwell to have meaningful conversations.
So, I mean, I'll start off with Nish, just from your experience as a trainee, and then Alex, I'll ask you what you guys do in Australia, but...
Just New Zealand, sorry.
Sorry.
No, that's right. I wouldn't be allowed back in if they... It's an important distinction.
Sorry. But actually, I'm referring to Down Under in general, really. What do you guys do in that part of the world to prepare your trainees, first year, first day on the ward, where you've got such a high mortality rate? So Nish, from when you started, did you get any support, any preparation for working on the ward, on the unit?
So as an intensive care trainee, as a registrar, probably not. I think I had a lot of conversations about being an ITU trainee, that we are going to have these conversations that are going to be uncomfortable. But I don't think I had any formal training. I probably witnessed a lot of conversations with my seniors and consultants having that conversation of end of life, and I think those conversations have been inspiring, and I've certainly passively learned quite a lot from that. But there's no direct or communication skills training. So for example, GP training has a lot of communication skills training on how to break bad news, how to talk to patients, how to deal with difficult patients in their practice. And I think certainly intensive care training benefit from more training in that respect.
And what about New Zealand? What do you do in your unit?
So we've just started on Monday last week. We had 19 new registrars start in ICU. We have a 2.5-day orientation program that teaches them a whole lot of stuff, but we have a specific hour-long session with a palliative care consultant who comes and talks to them about breaking bad news and dealing with death. And that's something we've been doing now for probably about 4 years, and it came about because our trainees come from a mixture of specialties, but the one area that we had not identified potentially as a problem but came about from feedback at the end of their 6-month run was anaesthetists, for whom death is a major event. A death in theatres may occur once or twice a year. Theatre stops, they have a debrief, everyone's sent home. In ICU, death occurs once every other day. We carry on. We keep going simply because we can't stop, because we can't. This is often a planned death, but we learn a lot, I guess, from the support that the anaesthetists give to their trainees and they give to each other, as to about how we should probably support our trainees in doing that. So part of that gap was to have a palliative care physician come and talk to people about having bad conversations. We also mentor a lot. We're running mentor programs for all our trainees. They're paired up with an ICU consultant at the start of their run if they want to be. So they've got someone they can come and talk to make sure they're okay. In terms of the meetings, we would, unless there was any major factor preventing it, we wouldn't be having those sort of meetings. We wouldn't send a junior trainee in to talk to a family. We'd have a consultant leading it, and we'd have the registrar or registrars present, so they can see what we do and they can learn from the communication styles that we all use. So we've got 9 ICU consultants. We have different communication styles. We have different ways of breaking bad news. But at the end of 6 months, you've seen us all do it in one way or another, and you choose what's right for you, but also what's right for the circumstance, because we have quite different approaches probably in terms of what we do. There's something that may be New Zealand specific that I noticed probably more so coming from the UK, where I'd worked in ICU and then going to Australia, that in New Zealand there's a much more pragmatic approach to death. that Kiwi families generally want to talk about it, and because there's not a predominance, but there's certainly a large number of people who are from rural communities. I have had family meetings where the family have come to us and say, we'd like you to stop, we think you've gone on too long. And in one memorable comment, a farmer who said, if that was my dog, I would have shot it by now.
Wow.
Talking about his wife. Now, that wasn't a heartless comment to make, it was simply the fact that she's suffering, we should stop. I wouldn't treat an animal the way that you are treating my family, but he didn't mean it like that. He meant he was grateful for the care that's being received.
Thank you for speaking to us. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Alex, before you go, is there, if people want to learn more about this, is there any sources of any way that you would recommend?
That's a great question. I don't know. I feel loath to point out to a YouTube talk that I've given because that's self-promotion and I don't like doing that generally. But if you Google my name, unfortunately I'm the only one with that name apart from my brother who doesn't talk about death. He's a drama teacher. He's written a book which is awesome, but it's nothing to do with dying. But there's a talk I gave at SMAC where essentially is the same thing, and I don't know if any of the talks here are going to be made available online, but that's my approach to why we do what we do.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. Thanks.
Thank you.